it can seem like a subtle distinction between those two, but if you were to treat social anxiety the way that other people do, when it's really driven by the autism, you might feel like you're not trying hard enough to improve or you're doing something wrong, when in reality, it's just kind of trying to fix the wrong problem.
Hey everybody, before we start the show, I want to make a couple disclaimers. This show does cover a wide variety of topics related to mental health and life in general, and some of those could be sensitive for you. I want to simultaneously encourage you to be brave in consuming difficult content, but also respect and recognize your limitations. So please use your best judgment. I will never be offended if you need to skip a question or an episode entirely, but feel free to feel it out, check out the episode, and just see what happens. If you need to skip, that's okay, but feel free to give it a shot first. I also need to say that while I am a psychologist, I'm not your psychologist, and I'm not your therapist. This is not intended to be direct medical advice, and you should not use this as a substitute for professional help. So with those said, let's go ahead and get into the show.
All right. Hello, friends of all varieties. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast, episode 365. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff, aka Duff the Psych. I make mental health content for real people, just like you. And today I have a really good question and answer episode with very interesting questions from listeners like yourselves. If you would like to send me in a question for a future episode of the show, please send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com or go to duffthepsych.com and use the contact form there. And I appreciate everybody who has sent in a question. They're all amazing, and it's great to have a good variety of things to answer. It's crazy. I was looking back at older episodes because I was asked to find an episode for somebody, and I'm like, I think that was pretty early on. I'm scrolling back. I'm like, okay, 2022, 2021, 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017, 2016. Like, I've been doing the show for so long, 365 episodes. So I know some of you guys out there are like lifers for the podcast, and you've been with me from the start. So as always, special shout out to you. But it's so wild to think this has been a part of my life and part of many of your lives for years. So I think I probably mentioned this every few episodes, just about how amazing it is. But yeah, I was struck by that today because I went back to, I think, episode 15 or something to dig up a link for somebody. So it's been a while, guys. I hope that you're treating yourselves well. I hope that you are happy and healthy and cozy. It is nighttime right now, so hopefully I don't have a cricket or grasshopper or whatever that's making a ton of noise. I was informed recently that one of my episodes, there was a cricket in the background the whole time, and they could be very loud over here. So I'm not hearing any right now, but knowing my luck, one will pop up and start trolling me. Anyways, I don't have too much to get into from the start, except I did start an Etsy shop. A lot of you saw that on Instagram already. I'm not like heavily promoting it, but there's a lot of cute sort of psychology related stuff, and I'm leaning into a lot of the Halloween and spooky things right now. So a lot of mugs, for instance. I designed a series of mugs that are all different psychiatric medications like Effexor or Buspar or Lexapro, and put them on like Halloween potion bottle kind of vibes. And so those are pretty fun. But if you want to check that out, just go to my Instagram and use the link there in my bio, or go to Etsy. The shop is called Silly Psychology. Silly starting with a P. So like Psychology. But that's all I'm going to say about that. And let's go ahead and jump into the first question. Here it goes. Hi, Dr. Duff. I'm a 35-year-old female. I have MDD, which is major depressive disorder, and social anxiety. I've tried over 15 medications over the years. TMS, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and most recently ketamine infusions, as well as many years of talk therapy. I'm also a recovering alcoholic of 8 years, but use marijuana to help my anxiety and mood. I recently started seeing a therapist who brought up that she thinks I might be on the autism spectrum. I don't disagree, and I've wondered about this myself off and on for years. She said that an official diagnosis is expensive, and there's a several-month wait list, and little benefit to getting an official diagnosis. Do you agree with this, and in your experience, would a diagnosis help aim treatment differently for my depression and social anxiety? Aside from psilocybin and ECT, which is shock therapy, I've exhausted most treatments and I'm still struggling. Thanks for taking the time to read this. Wow. You have been through a whole lot. 15 medications, TMS, ketamine infusions, talk therapy for years. I am very, very proud of you for trying so hard to take care of yourself by engaging in so many treatments. But I'm hearing that despite all of your efforts in these various treatments, you're still struggling with your mood, still struggling with the anxiety. So I'm sorry that that's happening. I know it can feel like an uphill battle at times, but I think that you are very, very strong for continuing to fight and finding all of these different avenues. You're very resourceful. So the question here is basically whether looking into autism and potentially getting a diagnosis could be a different avenue to help improve your situation where these other approaches haven't really done the trick, or at least maybe provide a different aim for the treatment that you've been getting. So I want to dive into that. First off, though, let's kind of clarify what autism or autism spectrum disorders are. Please keep in mind that the language surrounding this varies, and there are different perspectives on autism altogether, even, over the years. So since I was in college to now, when I was in college, I started working with kids that were on the spectrum, doing a type of therapy that I don't really stand by anymore, that being ABA therapy. Though that's a whole ball of wax we don't need to get into. But anyway, I used to, for, a number of years, 5+ years, work with kids that were on the spectrum. And even from then to now, the language that's used is pretty different. So for instance, some individuals would consider autism to be what they would call a neurotype rather than a disorder, meaning it's not like there's something wrong with somebody who has autism or is on the spectrum, but instead it's just a different way of being, and that should be accepted, right? So there's a lot of variance there. I'm not going to tiptoe around, my language and fumble around too much. So please excuse, if I use a term or something that, at the time you're listening to this doesn't really fit with the way that you see it or the way that, it's talked about in general. I'll do my best here though. So with all that in mind, autism is what we would consider a neurodevelopmental condition, meaning the brains of people on the spectrum, they develop differently from people that would be considered, quote, neurotypical. And there's a few areas in which autism impacts the individuals that have it. So you probably heard of a lot of these, but I want to dig into it just a bit to give some clarification. So first off, very often people with autism are different with regard to social communication. So what does that mean? Somebody with autism may have difficulty with social reciprocity, meaning the back and forth of a conversation. There's a certain flow to conversations for most people with, saying things, waiting to hear responses, and there's a implied kind of back and forth about it. And that may be difficult for somebody on the spectrum to fully understand and play out. It can also be that they have trouble initiating or responding to social interactions. And in conversation, they might also have trouble interpreting things like nonverbal cues, body language, gestures, facial expressions. And it can also present as unusual nonverbal communication from the person that's on the spectrum themselves, right? So maybe eye contact that people would consider unusual. That could be very fleeting or very intense, or strange body language, like different kind of posture than other people might exhibit when they're talking. Strange might be the wrong word there. You can see how it's hard to sometimes get all of the language to be as neutral as possible. So strange not meaning bad, but strange in the term of, not what you would typically see among most people out there. So those are a couple ways that the social communication could be impacted. It also relates to the ability to maintain and understand relationships. So somebody with autism may have trouble adapting their behavior to fit different social contexts. And on the far end of the spectrum, some people might not show any particular desire to even interact with peers or other people. So that's the social communication part. Autism is also characterized by repetitive patterns of behaviors or interests or activities. So there's a wide umbrella here. This could be repetitive movements. So in children, for instance, and some adults, you might see kind of repetitive movements such as hand flapping, rocking, things of that sort. Sometimes people call this stimming. It's like self-stimulating behavior. Use of objects or even speech, like, for instance, echolalia, where you might repeat words over and over or parrot back what somebody says. And many people with autism are also very rigid in terms of their adherence to routines, rituals, and just wanting a lot of sameness in general. And then with that, you might also have fixations, like hyperfixations on specific objects or interests. There are some people that have collections that are related to this, or they just spend a lot of time thinking and talking and looking into things about a specific interest. Sometimes they call them stereotyped interests, meaning just very much, boxed into one particular category. Hyperreactivity or hypo, meaning underreactivity to sensory input, also falls into here. So somebody with autism might be very, very sensitive to certain sounds or even textures. And this can go either way. It might be something that they enjoy, or it might be something that is very displeasurable, right? So certain textures may really, really give somebody the ick, or might make them feel uncomfortable or even hurt to their skin. Whereas a different type of texture might be something they really, really gravitate toward and actually want to maybe rub on their face or feel between their fingers or something like that. So just sort of heightened, or on the flip side, very underreactive to sensory input. So some people can be undersensitive to things like pain or temperature. And this is something I've definitely seen firsthand with some of the kids that I used to work with. I'm thinking of one in particular who, he presented a unique challenge because he really, really, really was undersensitive to pain and discomfort and stuff. So he was very strong and very rough. And, I have had broken glasses and some bumps and bruises and stuff from trying to work with this kid way back in the day. But yeah, you can have either end of that. And then with autism, there may or may not be any difficulty with reasoning ability, right? So some people with autism do also have, intellectual disability, meaning like a lower IQ, trouble with reasoning ability, but that's certainly not everybody. And so it can be there or not. So that's kind of a broad overview of, autism spectrum disorders. Of course, there are specific criteria and this number of that and this number of this, but that should give you a flavor for it. And listening to that, you can probably see how there are so many different possible presentations, which is why it can be a challenge. It can be such a challenge to just see, say a TikTok video or something like that and be like, oh yeah, that fits me, because it can look so different from person to person. And then for the person writing in, this person's a woman, and for women, autism is often very under-recognized, at least here in the US, because the behaviors that we typically associate with autism, they can be more readily apparent in boys, especially at a younger age. So this can lead to situations where you fly under the radar your whole life. You experience difficulties, things don't quite add up the way they do for others in terms of, the effort you put in versus what you get out of it. And maybe you attribute that to a different cause, or simply blame yourself for being dumb or bad or awkward. But yeah, this is sometimes how it works. You sort of fly under that radar and it's never picked out because you don't look like the typical, whatever that means, presentation of somebody with autism. But that doesn't mean that you don't have it. So I want to go more into sort of the specifics for your situation. But first I want to take a quick break and talk about today's sponsor. Okay, so today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Do you ever find that you are very tired, and when you lay down to go to bed, you get all cozied up and you're like, okay, it's time for sleep. And then suddenly your mind goes, yeah, no, we're going to think about anything and everything. Like your brain just won't stop talking at you. This happens to me, relatively frequently, especially if I'm, dead tired or there's some other vulnerability. My mind just takes off running. And it's not always even negative things, but certainly that can happen. But just like bam, 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 thoughts and thoughts and thoughts. Turns out that one great way to get thoughts to go away is to actually get them out of your brain. And this could be writing or journaling for some people, but for others, it's more helpful to have somebody to talk to about them. So therapy gives you a really great place to do that. You can get your negative thought cycles out there and find some peace. Make your brain stop rehearsing these things over and over, especially if it involves kind of those what-if scenarios. So therapy is a great option for that. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and flexible and suited to your schedule, so you can send a message to your therapist at any time. All you do is fill out a brief questionnaire, and that will get you matched with a licensed therapist, not self-help, but a licensed therapist. And if it's not a good match, you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So get a break from your thoughts with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/duff today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/duff. Okay, back to the question here. A lot of the symptoms that you've described, like social anxiety, could definitely be explained or at least influenced by autism. A lot of people with autism do have social anxiety, right? They have anxiety in social situations, absolutely. But if you think about it, the interpretation of this difficulty would be different. When you're talking about social anxiety for somebody that's not on the spectrum, it might be fueled by irrational thoughts about not fitting in, kind of being on a stage and having people judging your behaviors. But with autism, it might simply be very uncomfortable and difficult to cope with the whole navigating social environments because it's just simply not how your brain works because of that social emotional difficulty that you might have. And it can seem like a subtle distinction between those two, but if you were to treat social anxiety the way that other people do, when it's really driven by the autism, you might feel like you're not trying hard enough to improve or you're doing something wrong, when in reality, it's just kind of trying to fix the wrong problem. So that's one way that I think it really could clarify the approach that you take in other types of treatments. So I can totally see why you have an interest in getting an evaluation for autism. And I wouldn't totally agree with your therapist that there's little use in getting a diagnosis at this point in your life. I think that the opposite is true. In my experience, where there are situations in which somebody learns about unique aspects of themselves that have always been there, a lot of things get clarified in retrospect, right? So for instance, I have a friend, a very close friend of mine, and she is transgender. And looking back, a lot of her mental health issues and other types of problems she had can be explained by the fact that she just wasn't able to live as her true self in the world. Obviously, this isn't a perfect comparison, right? Because she's always known that she's a woman, but she was pressured and tried very hard to convince herself that she was indeed a man, including being in the military, things like that, doing things that, would kind of prove that to her. But it didn't work, and it caused severe mental health issues and all sorts of things. And while her life isn't perfect and her mental health isn't perfect now, those particular issues aren't there anymore because she's allowed to be who she is. She's allowed herself to do that. So for your situation, maybe there's something that's kind of parallel there where you've always known something doesn't quite add up. And it's more than a matter of just doing more therapy and taking more medication, doing more treatments to work through the symptoms. Maybe it's that you were born into a world that isn't totally made for, it isn't totally friendly for people like you. Not a matter of not trying hard enough. It's just a fundamental difference that you've lived with. So for that reason, I think that getting a diagnosis can be really validating for you and for your experience so far in your life. I know a number of people that have been evaluated for autism as adults in their 30s, and all of them that I know personally are very grateful that they did. Now, that's not to say that it was not scary, because most of them have been very scared of the prospect for sure, because it can be scary regardless of the outcome, right? If you're told that you are indeed different, that you do have autism, that can be scary in its own way. And then, of course, if you're told that your suspicions are actually not founded, right? That, oh, nope, there's nothing wrong with you. That can also feel very invalidating, or, it's a scary thing to think that maybe you made it up in your head or something. But in the end, everybody that I know personally that's been through this process has felt like they're finally able to, be seen, and in some cases not be gaslit, and be able to assert who they are and live as they actually are. I don't have autism. I'm not on the spectrum. And I have to imagine that the therapist you're working with doesn't have autism either. I could be wrong about that, but just, for somebody to say it probably wouldn't do much for you to have a diagnosis, I have to imagine that they aren't on the spectrum. So if you haven't had the chance yet, it may be a good idea to talk to somebody that does have autism to get their perspective on this. This could be a personal acquaintance if you have one, or somebody that you find online, say on Reddit or something like that. They may be able to give you a more informed perspective since they actually understand. And, I can tell you, everything that I have to say about this, but it's just a different sort of perspective. When you've actually been there, you can actually get it to an extent. So I would definitely encourage that. Now, aside from validating your experience and giving you more appropriate ways to interpret the trouble that you've experienced in your life, I think that it would help, meaning a diagnosis would help, to better tailor your treatment. Because even just doing talk therapy, psychotherapy, it's not necessarily going to be the same with somebody that is, neurotypical versus somebody that has autism. And I can't promise that this will be the case, but it is possible that getting some answers to your questions and understanding more about who you are could potentially be healing in and of itself, and it might resolve some of that inner turmoil that leads to depression and anxiety in the first place. And I have seen this play out for sure in my own clinical work with people that have been finally able to be themselves, their true selves, and recognize that inner, within themselves, and also show it outwardly. And suddenly issues that have been there for a very long time start to fade away, or at least become less severe, because the issue is really that difficulty internally with that dissonance there. Now, you are totally right that assessment is not always accessible and it's not always affordable. And this really depends on where you live, what kind of, obviously what country, what state, but also what kind of neighborhood that you're in, what sort of city you're in. I would say that it's totally worth doing some research though, and contacting people about it. And you can start with a simple Google search. If you go onto Google and search for your city and autism evaluations, that should give you a start. You're most likely going to find a variety of results like clinics, individual providers, hospital programs, maybe even universities. And any of those are a good place to start. I would say, please don't be afraid to ask for help. If there's something like a bigger organization, like a regional organization that might have more information about how to get an assessment, I would reach out to them and just ask how you can get started. Universities similarly are a great place to start, because even if they don't have the exact services that you're looking for, they're probably going to know the resources in the area and will be more than happy to, point you in the right direction. And then in some cases, the cost isn't fully on you. A lot of people's health insurance can also help out with getting an evaluation. It may take some doing and it may take some finagling, but this is something that could be possible. Obviously I can't give you a ton of direct advice on this front, but I would just be careful not to make too many assumptions without first gathering information, right? Don't convince yourself that there's no way you're going to be able to get an evaluation without actually doing your due diligence. Make some calls, send some emails, figure out what your options are. Because I've known people that have paid full cost, $3,000 or more for an evaluation. I know people that have had their assessments completed completely for free because there was a university program or something like that. I know similarly people who have gone through university and had a drastically lowered price for their assessment, or people that have been able to get it covered by insurance. So do some research. If you don't have the ability to do that research, maybe you can find somebody to help you do some of that research on your behalf. But again, don't quit before you start. If I were one of your providers myself, or if I was a family member of yours, I would be very interested in making sure you get an evaluation. It's not like there's some sort of miracle treatment that's going to solve everything for you once you get an accurate diagnosis, but it will help guide things, right? Even basic CBT therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, would be influenced by the knowledge of that diagnosis. Like, consider a situation when you were having say extreme anxiety about going to a holiday party for a company or something like that. So you're super, super anxious about the prospect of going to this party. Doing CBT with somebody who is neurotypical might involve identifying and challenging faulty assumptions that are leading to those anxiety symptoms. And for someone on the spectrum, that may not be quite as helpful as just identifying the source of the discomfort through the frame of autism, understanding, why that's so uncomfortable, and not trying to solve it as much as work on self-regulation, changing expectations and adapting in some sort of way if appropriate. So that would be a totally different approach. All this is to say, I think that you deserve to find some answers. I think that diagnosis could be very validating and helpful for you. And it doesn't mean that all the work you put in is for nothing, but you're still relatively young. You're only 35, and I think this is a totally valid thing to look into. It's not always easy to get evaluated, but it's not impossible either. So best of luck to you, and thank you very much for writing in. Okay, so question 2, we're diving into some different territory here. It reads, "Hi, Duff. I love your podcast. Thank you so much for what you do. I've sought out a lot of my own research and self-help for years, your podcast included, but recently finally found a therapist of my own who I match with well and am able to be comfortable sharing vulnerable subjects. I was diagnosed with PTSD, which stems from my husband's PTSD episodes. He's a combat veteran and has also had 2 TBIs, which are traumatic brain injuries, during the course of 6 deployments. I've been struggling lately with prioritizing my mental health above his and allowing his mood and episodes to control my emotions in my life. My husband does not see a therapist and has not been going to the VA for his appointments for about 2 years now. He's afraid he's going crazy because his memory is getting much worse. He forgets small things, whole events, conversations, and a few times has forgotten up to a week at a time. Could you talk a bit about how to prioritize my own health and also when to decide the relationship is too unhealthy to continue? Sincerely, deeply loving somebody with PTSD. Well, thank you for the question. It's so great that you've been able to make that jump from self-help to getting professional help. I'm proud of you for that. And it sounds like you found somebody good, which is great. I always say that professional help is a form of self-help, right? It's a resource that's out there available to you, and you make the choice to seek it out and utilize it. Nobody's forcing you to. And even if they were, you would still have to participate to get something out of it. So great job with that. And as always, thank you for including me as part of your self-help journey. It's a pleasure. So I want to clarify a couple things as usual before getting into your question proper. I talked a lot about the criteria for PTSD in the last episode, so I don't need to fully dive into that. Definitely check it out if you would like. Episode 364. Is that what we're on now? 365? Yeah. Episode 364. If you just scroll back on your podcast app, you should be able to find it. And I talk about the specific criteria for PTSD. So definitely review that if you want to. But your particular situation is a great example of the nuance that can exist in PTSD. Because if somebody was looking at your situation from the outside, it might be tempting to consider just your husband to be a main candidate for PTSD, given his combat history and things like that. But PTSD can also be caused by, violent or explosive situations at home. It could be caused by knowing about things that have happened to your husband because you care about him, or hearing repeated vivid stories about things that have happened to him. I'm not sure if any of this, perfectly captures the source of your PTSD, but it just goes to show that trauma does not mean the same thing to everyone or for everyone. Remember, it bears repeating, trauma is not the event itself. It's not like something is universally a trauma or a traumatic event. It depends on your body's response to it. So what traumatizes one person may not traumatize somebody else and vice versa. So yeah, it's valid. And it's a good example of the nuance that is there in diagnosing PTSD. You also mentioned that your husband has 2 traumatic brain injuries during his service, and this can play a huge role in his day-to-day presentation. Brain injuries can have widely varying impacts that could change somebody's life. For instance, a frontal lobe brain injury, so right behind your forehead, injury to that area could cause somebody to have trouble with impulsivity or recklessness. It could lead to difficulty controlling and regulating their emotions. So you get really, really strong emotional reactions with no ability to rein it back in. A brain injury that's more diffuse across the entire brain, like from an explosion. A lot of veterans have these types of brain injuries from, IEDs and things like that. And that could cause somebody to be slower in their thinking, meaning kind of the connections in their brain just become rattled and sheared is what we call it. So their thinking is less efficient. And that can lead to frustration when trying to go through daily life and reasoning through situations. Somebody getting hit with from a car accident or a blunt object to the side of the head, they could definitely have language impairment and difficulty communicating, or memory impairment in that case. So there's a lot of different ways that it could present. And this means that it takes the difficult circumstances surrounding PTSD and potentially amplifies them, right? You have somebody who is hyper-reactive because of PTSD, and then you add a frontal lobe brain injury onto that, and they might really fly off the handle behaviorally when they're triggered. So yeah, it's tough. And I don't blame you at all for falling into the situation where you're allowing his mood episodes to control your life and your emotions. You love him, and neither of you asked for this. I don't know your exact situation, but I'm imagining that things haven't always been like this in your relationship. Maybe you were dating or married prior to the combat and the deployments and all the PTSD. If that's the case, then it makes it even harder because you know how things were in the past and you would love to be able to get back to that, but it's just not happening. So one thing I would ask is whether you are all alone in terms of family, friends, and those sorts of supports. Does anybody else know about the situation? Because there's only so much you can do from the inside. I kind of think of it like a hurricane, and you're in the eye of the storm for yourself and along with him. So from inside the storm, it's really tough to encourage him to get appropriate help. And sometimes it's more helpful to have a support network that's also urging him to take care of himself and providing some accountability and care. And And this is also important for you because it can feel so isolating to be living with volatility. And it sounds like that's going on at home. It sounds like there are some kind of, I'm not sure what behaviors we're seeing, but whether they're violent or just, extreme, loud, angry, what have you, it can be very hard and very isolating if you don't have a place to vent or get understanding. And I know you have a therapist now, which is great, and I highly encourage it. But, that's also just once a week or however frequently you have sessions. So if it's appropriate and safe for you to do so, I would encourage you to be open with some of your loved ones and allow them to support both of you. Now, your husband, I agree, definitely needs to be going to the doctor because it's not just the PTSD that's happening here. He's had brain injuries. And so neurological follow-up, seeing a neurologist would be very, very important to make sure that there isn't something serious behind his complaints about memory and going crazy. And you said you've seen changes too about his memory. Typically, a brain injury isn't going to be progressive in nature, meaning get worse and worse and worse, but it does make your brain more vulnerable to other issues. And, it's definitely not something that's expected to get a whole lot better after a few years. So it's totally worth looking into and understanding what's going on, meaning brain imaging, maybe even neuropsychological testing like I do. Whatever the case may be, actually paying attention to it and not just ignoring it because, we don't want to miss anything. But obviously, this question isn't all about him. This is about you trying to take care of yourself, which is awesome. I want to be clear that this is a tough situation, whichever way you cut it. And there isn't some obvious solution that's hanging right in front of your face that you're ignoring. It's difficult. You're doing what you can. I think that you are on the right track with your question, though, wondering how you can prioritize your own mental health and thinking about when to make that difficult call that you just can't do it anymore. I think that you're absolutely allowed to have boundaries with your husband. Even if he has a hard time controlling himself and following them, you're allowed to have boundaries. That doesn't mean that you love him. And in some cases, the boundaries are even an expression of love because they might help him from falling into a negative cycle. So you are allowed to have them. And I have a few tips about all of this. So first, make sure that you are having adequate time alone or with loved ones that does not involve him. Even in situations where his behavior is relatively in check and you're around mutual friends or family in a social situation, I can imagine that your brain never really fully shuts off and allows you to relax because you're just a bit on edge, right? Wondering if something's going to be triggering to either of you and what's going to happen there. So you may kind of put on a good face, but you might be still in the back of your mind on edge. So I'm talking about doing things just with you, right? Going out to a meal or an outing with friends or family, even just by yourself. You are allowed to have your own life, and I encourage you to embrace that. And then on the topic of boundaries, you may also need to institute some boundaries in the home regarding personal space or quiet time, things that will allow you to regulate your own nervous system. And of course, this also plays a role when you're talking about communication, right? What sort of approaches are and are not okay when it comes to you guys communicating. If you haven't yet, communication with him about this is vital, really important. Letting him know where you're at, that your mental health is becoming unsustainable, that you're extremely worried about your marriage lasting if something doesn't change, and that you think he really needs to get appropriate treatment and care if this is going to work, right? Putting that stuff out there can be extremely important. If it's difficult to talk to one another, you might consider also enlisting the help of a therapist, like a couples therapist, to help guide the conversation between you and try to keep it constructive. And if that isn't something that's an option, a trusted loved one or an advisor that you guys have, if that would be more productive, go for it. Anybody that can help facilitate those conversations, it's okay if you need to do that. In addition to talking to your therapist and working on things like I imagine you're probably working on issues related to, codependency, personalization, things like that, this is also prime time to do inner work on your own. So getting books related to these topics, listening to podcasts aside from mine related to these topics, journaling frequently, and just reflecting on how you're feeling and why you're feeling how you do, and whether there might be anything to adjust in your own approach or behavior. These are all really helpful avenues for keeping yourself afloat and getting a better handle on just what's happening to you. On the communication front, you can literally tell him, babe, I know you're having a hard time with your emotions these days and you've been really triggered lately, but I need you to know that I've been letting your mood bleed into my own and it's really impacting me. And this isn't all on you. You're allowed to feel how you feel. I know that you have a hard time with that, but I need you to know that I need to keep myself afloat. So what that means is I'm going to be making an effort to be less codependent. It doesn't mean I don't love you, but if I'm not getting down into the trenches with you every time you're upset, that's why. It's not because I don't care, but I need to be able to take care of myself too. So please don't interpret that the wrong way, right? So sort of setting the stage so that he can understand. He may not take it well and he may not understand, but at least you're being clear about your needs and your intentions. So there's no real question about that. And then, in the end, when it comes to that hard decision, right? When is it time to decide that the relationship is too unhealthy to continue? I think a lot of this is going to come down to the response to attempts at changing. So for example, if you try to get him into couples therapy and he refuses to do it, if you ask for certain reasonable boundaries and they're continuously violated, that might be a reason. If you make it clear that he's allowed to struggle, but he has to get appropriate care if you're going to be able to stay in this relationship, and then he continues to avoid it, those are all reasons that I could see, moving on. And it's also important for you to take a look at the two of you together, just as the two of you being a unique combination of individuals. Are there patterns that you bring out in each other that are just uniquely unhealthy that may not be there if you guys weren't together? So, would both of you actually be better off not playing into each other's issues? It's a really hard question to answer, and I don't know the answer to that, but these are the sort of things that I encourage you to process and journal frequently about. But overall, I just want to reassure you, you're not doing anything wrong. There's no perfect way to do this and figure this out. Taking actions to literally prioritize your own time and your own emotional health, like getting therapy, getting out, getting away, things like that, totally reasonable. It's also reasonable to expect him to get some help for the behaviors that are disruptive and harmful to both of you. Try communicating, and if that doesn't work, try enlisting help to communicate. If that doesn't work, you may need to think about keeping yourself safe and preserving your own mental health outside of the relationship. So I hope those thoughts are helpful to you. I'm sure you've thought about some of this before, but just want to validate you and point out that, this is difficult, that you're not missing something obvious, and I hope that these thoughts were, useful to you. So thank you for the question. And with that, that's the end of the episode, everybody. This has been episode 365 of the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. If you want the show notes, go to duffthepsych.com/episode 365. And if you want to send me a question for a future episode, please send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com. All right, guys, take care of yourselves. That's it. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you for the next one. Bye.